So a good place to start is, well, go back in history and look at the people who did a lot of the research in the science of motivation. What are their theories? How did they lay the groundwork for the research being done today? A lot of the things I'm going to talk about in this lecture on history and motivation will come up again and again when we talk about other theories. Well, good place to start with this is to go way back and look at the hedonists or hedonism, this idea of behaviors ultimately modified by reducing pain and seeking pleasure. And this is really fundamental to most animals. Animals have a sense of these things, so it's not just for humans. And oftentimes hedonism, when we're talking about with humans, it's oftentimes just sex and chocolate and these overwhelming pleasures. But it doesn't always have to be that hedonistic, I guess. So, well, if we look back, it's in our Declaration of Independence. It's one of the first things our founders thought about. Okay? Among all the... We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Or countries based on this idea that people should be allowed to pursue this happiness. It's the founding principle of our country. So I'm only going to give you a real short tour of the idea of hedonism, but let's break them up into these two basic philosophies. Well, there's psychological hedonisms. You know, this is how we're constructed. This is how our mind works. We have areas of the brain that sense goodness. Certainly a lot of areas of the brain that detect pain. We are shaped and motivated by seeking pleasure, reducing pain. It's the way our nervous system is set up. We have neurotransmitters for these things. We'll come back to those a little bit later. And then there's the idea of ethical hedonism, which is the view that, well, it's what we should be doing. It's how we should be living our lives, seeking out pleasure. This is our obligation to maximize our pleasure throughout our life. And a lot of philosophers had this idea. I mean, if we go to Epicurus, you know, he talked about, well, he was one of the first real ancient philosophers, you know, to talk about empiricism, to talk about looking at the world through our senses, natural phenomenon, that we shouldn't really be looking to supernatural things to dictate our lives. But he also talked about pleasure, about how we should seek out pleasure in our lives. We recognize pleasure as the first good innate in us. And from pleasure we begin every act of choice and avoidance. And to pleasure we return again, using the feeling as the standard by which we judge every good. Okay? And he wrote a lot about this. And it's not pleasure again in this, you know, the sense of it just all about me and having a good time. You know, he got a little deeper than that. But he says this is where we start. This is our first principle. So this is a fundamental principle. You know, I studied animal behavior for a long time. A lot of the theories about how animals learn, how animals take that learning translated into behavior, comes down to seeking pleasure, reducing pain, reducing unpleasantness. It's the cornerstone of so many philosophies, divergent philosophies on what motivates humans. Socrates wrote about this. Hobbes wrote about it. Spencer, Thorndike. We'll talk about Thorndike here in a little while. Even Sigmund Freud, you know, he talked about this pleasurable, this pleasure-seeking part of our brain. And we're in a society where we're constantly trying to keep that in check with societal norms and all those kinds of things. You know, he called this thing the id. We had the, you know, conscious and the subconscious and the id, this pleasure-seeking part of our anatomy, if you will. You know, I want what I want it now. And a lot of his philosophies, I'm not sure if his theories are scientific, but certainly he had some wonderful ideas and philosophies, you know, came driven by this notion of pleasure as being a fundamental principle. So if we look at the idea of hedonism, you know, what is pleasurable? Well, pleasure facilitates behavior. If an animal or person does a behavior is followed by something pleasurable, they'll continue to do that behavior again. Something that's unpleasant, they'll decrease that. But what is pleasurable? Well, this gets a little circular. This is a circular argument because behavior increases if what follows is pleasurable. How do you know it's pleasurable? Because it increased behavior. So sometimes when we look at these pleasure ideas, these pleasure principle ideas and theories, we have to go a little deeper. We have to look at them a little bit more, a little bit better operationally defined. And we'll get to that here in just a bit. Also, it's a little bit subjective, isn't it? What's pleasurable to you? I mean, skydiving, would that be pleasurable to you, or would that be terribly painful and fearful? Some people like to go to Star Trek conventions or Comic-Con. Other people wouldn't be caught dead there. Unpleasurable. What about pain as pleasure? A lot of people like getting tattoos. They talk about the pain of it, but the pleasure of it, I like running. I like running marathons. At the end of a marathon, there is nothing pleasurable about that. Everything hurts, but there's something very rewarding about doing it. So it produces this subjective sense of pleasure. What's pleasurable and painful to one person depends, on that individual. And so sometimes universal ideas of pleasure aren't always true, except for chocolate, of course. Chocolate is delicious to everybody. Well, I think. But this idea of hedonism, of pleasure, is not the only way to look at increasing behavior. Sometimes something violates these pleasurable principles, hedonistic principles, but still can motivate pleasure. Let's give an example. There's a lot of experimental examples of this idea, but a rat will press a lever. If it's low on sugar, you press a lever to get an injection into its tail. Well, that sugar doesn't taste good because it's going to his tail. It's going into his bloodstream. There's nothing pleasurable about it, but it reduces the animal's need for sugar, reduces the drive of hunger. Maybe that's pleasurable, but not the time they're doing it. But they'll keep doing it. They'll still do the behavior, even though what follows is not necessarily pleasurable. Another example, a male rat will run through a maze to get to another female rat. The female rat is in estrus. In other words, she's ready for mating. But if you remove that female rat, the male gets there, remove the female, the rat will still run to get there. Will still run to get there even though it doesn't get to have sex. Okay? That's not pleasurable. That's frustrating to the little rat, here's the female and she's in the mood for some loving, she's ready, she's in estrus, and he runs really fast through the maze. Wow, that's a fast rat. Look at that. Woo! And then we take her away. That's frustrating. That animal's not a happy animal. You pick up that animal now, it'll probably bite you. But you still put him at the beginning of the maze and he'll still run towards that inevitable outcome. So these are just some of the examples about how pure sort of idea of pleasure isn't the only motivating factors. So also we need to look at trade-offs between the intensity or the magnitude of the reinforcement, how much money, how much food, whatever, and the amount of effort and difficulty in getting that reward. So if you had to go and walk outside and walk back in for $10, you'd do that in a second. But if I asked you to walk 30 miles and back for $10, it's still $10, but you wouldn't do it, So we talk about this as a cost-benefit analysis. And animals do this and people do this. Also, the relationship that I've come back to this again and again, the relationship between the actual behavior and the reward that follows. Is there a relationship in terms of their temporal contiguity? Do they occur together? That's very important and a fundamental principle to maintain behavior. Something pleasurable has to occur relatively quickly after the behavior. So could be a relationship between the amount of effort and the amount of reward, but also an inverse relationship between the amount of effort and how long you have to wait to get the reward. We're going to look at that mathematically in section 4. I know you can't wait. You want the math now. Well, we can take a look at it briefly. Now, I want things now. We can look at these issues related to what's known as impulsivity and self-control. These are important principles in child development, in animal behavior, in so many aspects. I study this in my lab, self-control and impulsivity. We're going to come back to this. We're going to look at this a little bit more theoretical. But individuals display self-control if they forego a small reward now to get a larger reward later. And impulsive if they want something more immediate. I'm giving you a little hint of what's to come, but here's something that's kind of interesting. One thing we know about people who have addictions, who maintain addictions, have higher levels of impulsivity. And this is just on simple surveys when you ask them questions like, okay, I just want you to imagine something. Would you take $5 now, or would you take $100 in 3 weeks? Imagine somebody giving you that option. Well, the person who takes the $5 now is impulsive. The person who takes the $300 in 3 weeks shows self-control. We can look at those relationships between weighting and amount. And people who are addicted to cocaine, to amphetamines, to alcohol, have greater impulsivity than other people. So this relationship between reward and delay has played an important role in many fields. In biology, in economics, in psychology. In fact, the work I did when I was in England at Oxford, I was in a zoology and biology department, and we studied economics and psychology of decision making in this very field. So get a $10,000 in credit now and pay nothing for 3 years. These are highly motivating things. People sell you furniture that you don't pay for in 2 years. People give you credit cards, buy now, pay later. This is a great motivator. It also gets us into a great deal of trouble. So, I want things now. You know, do you ever go to a store and you go and you get yourself some milk and you get bread and something healthy in the back of the store, and as you're checking out, what do they have right at the checkout? They have candy. Now, if you buy a candy bar there, right at the checkout, what do they do with that candy bar? They don't put it in the bag, they hand it to you. Because you know that if you get that candy, you can eat it right now. If you say, you can buy a candy, but you can't eat that chocolate bar until you get home, people don't buy it. People only buy it if they can eat it now. So we can learn a lot about looking at children with self-control and impulsivity problems, self-control problems. It tells us a lot about other aspects of their behavior and motivation. So we'll discuss impulsivity and self-control in future lectures. Another thing we're going to talk about in the future, but has been really come up a lot in history, is this idea of the principle of utility, and the idea of what is rewarding. What is rewarding has to benefit you, right? So let's say you're very hungry, you haven't eaten all day, and somebody asks you to do something. Go outside and run down the street and get something to eat. Well, you're willing to do that. You're willing to walk great distances to go get yourself a cheeseburger or something. But if you just ate a lot of food, well, a cheeseburger has no utility to you. It doesn't benefit you because you're full. We see this with money. We see this with a lot of aspects relating to usefulness. How useful is something to you will determine how much motivation you are to get it, how much behavior, the length of the behavior you are to get it. The same reward may have very different utility to different people at different times. Okay, so food might not have much utility to a satiated or full animal. We're going to look at that, and we can try to quantify that a little bit later. So let's go a little scenario here. I offer you $200 to wash my car. Would you do it? Really, you would? Okay, well, that's good to know. Because I'll tell you something right now. I'm a professor, and if you offer me $200 to wash your car, I'm going to wash your car. It's going to look great, okay? Because $200 has a great utility to me. Okay, I'm not a rich person. $200 is a lot of money. So that $200 produces a great deal of pleasure for me. I can buy things with it. I can use it. It's very useful to me. But what if I went to Bill Gates? He's the founder of Microsoft. He is one of the richest people in the entire world, if not the richest. I think he's up in the $80 billion as of the time I record this lecture. If I said, I'll give you $200 to wash my car, well, that's the same $200. It's the same objective amount, but it has no utility. Okay? What are you, crazy? I make $200 in the same time it takes me to say $200. Oh, made another $200. $200. This doesn't have utility to them. We can look at this when we look at issues related to what's known as behavioral economics, which is something I study. We're going to look at this curve a little later too, but it is a utility function. And if you follow this relationship, this is the actual amount of money. Down here is what's known as the objective line, this x-axis, actual amount. We take this actual amount, we go up, we hit this curve. Where it hits, we go over and we find its utility. Utility is subjective. This is objective. Over here is subjective. And the idea behind this curve is if I had this amount of money, not a great deal of money, this amount of money in my bank account, and I increased it by this amount. Let's say I had $1,000 in the bank account and I increased it to $3,000. That has great utility to me. Great utility because I'm on this curve. Look at that tremendous increase. Okay? Look at that increase up there. But if I start here and I increase it by the same amount, the same 3,000, but I'm up here and I have 100,000 in the bank, well, there's hardly any increase in utility for me at all. This is a very fundamental issue, and it relates to how people think about economics, make economic decisions, are motivated by everything from stocks to credit cards to making money at a job. Now, this is a curve that also looks at an objective and a subjective. Objective here is delay, how much you have to wait. This is known as delay discounting curve. If you don't wait at all, if you wait hardly at all, it has tremendous utility. Getting things immediately has great utility, usefulness. But as you wait in a delay, that utility can drop very quickly. Well, we can, as behavioral economics individuals, can look at this curve, can make some theoretical assumptions about this curve, can mathematically chart this curve, relating objective to subjective. That's one of the roles we have as psychologists, taking the real world and then incorporating it into how people see the world. Subjectivity, utility. We're going to come back to that curve. So let's do a little bit more history. I want to talk about a few people in the past, and these people I talk about in some of my other classes. Edward Thorndike, for example. He was interested in animal intelligence, interested in animal behavior, and was very strict about how he thought about research. Because before this, people would look at animal intelligence and animal behavior and be very subjective and they would create these anecdotes and tell these wonderful stories about smart animals. And Thorndike said, I think we could do this and look at these principles of how animals learn, how children learn, how people learn, and if these principles are similar, by looking at this very parsimoniously. Parsimoniously means without great assumptions on intelligence. Okay? So here's one of his very, very famous studies. He had a little cat, cat's in a box. The cat walks around the box, eventually hits a lever, and the door opens, and out he goes, and he gets himself some fish. Puts back into the cage, and he walks around, hits the lever, and out he goes. And what we find is that the animal gets faster and faster at opening up this box. Okay? So Thorndike observed the cat, took him less time, and he learned through what's known as trial and error learning. He tried and tried and tried and tried, made a lot of errors, And the erred behavior, the behavior like walking over to this side of the cage, well, the animal stopped doing that as much. The animal didn't walk to this side of the cage as much. He was over here, and he was sticking his paw in here more and more often. That's a trial and error learning. So animals didn't just look at the problem and say, oh, I understand how to do this. They had to learn by doing. Okay? They had to learn over several trials. It slowly got faster and faster at getting out. So this is the time it took for the animal to get out the first time, and then we see this kind of trial and error learning. If the cat went in here, took him a long time, hit the lever with his paw, and then he goes, oh, I get it. I totally get it. I hit the lever with my paw. That's how I get out. The next time he goes in and he wants to get out, it's like trial number 2. He's out in 2 seconds. But he had to learn over a lot of trial and error mechanisms, a lot of trying different things and slowly shaping into that specific behavior. So this is known as instrumental conditioning, and he called it instrumental conditioning because the behavior was instrumental in producing a favorable outcome, getting the fish or getting out of this cage he didn't want to be in. This also is similar in principle to operant conditioning, which B.F. Skinner talked about. I tend to talk about Thorndike a little more because of really historical precedents. He did a lot of the first research on this idea of outcome following behavior. Okay? In other words, reward is produced by getting an outcome. And Skinner did too, and he just called it something different. And has some different ideas about it. So here's some of the techniques. You have an animal and he's running around, he's hungry or whatever, and eventually hits this lever, he presses the lever, and out comes food. Well, he doesn't go back and press it right away. He's still running around, and then kind of fortuitously he presses the lever and out comes food. Slowly he gets better and better. That's a trial and error learning. Mazes are oftentimes used. Here's a T maze. I've used T mazes before. Here's a Y maze. The rat starts here, runs down, takes a right, gets food, takes a left, gets nothing. That kind of thing. It learns in that maze. Here's something I used in my lab a few years ago. It's a little fish. Fish swims down, takes a right, and he gets to fight, and that's his reward. Fight with another fish. Or he takes a left and he doesn't get to fight. Or he gets to fight for a long time, or there's some delay. So Thorndike said, and this is the empirical law of effect, and this is based on hedonism, it really is, of several responses made to the same situation, those of which are accompanied by satisfaction to the animal will be more likely to occur, and those followed with discomfort to the animal will be less likely to occur. You knew that before coming in, taking this class. You knew this very basic principle. People have been talking about this for a long time. What Thorndike tried to understand is, well, what are the mechanisms? What are the internal associations? How are things learned? Empirical, from your observation, we know this to be true. And in order to learn, according to Thorndike's principle, you need 2 things. One, you need behavior. You can't learn by watching. You can't learn by observing. You learn by behaving. And the second, a pleasurable outcome. Okay? Now, he went on to write a lot of books about child development and child learning and teachers, how to teach kids. And he says, well, if you want to teach kids, you get them up, you get them involved, you get them active. Because little kids are like animals, in a sense that we learn by doing. And we learn a lot of things by doing. I'll talk about that here in a second. There must be action and an outcome that is good for learning to take place. His theoretical law of effect is different from his empirical. It is a theoretical mechanism to account for what he observed. He said connections are formed, learned associations are formed between the behavior and the stimuli that precede the behavior if what follows is good, is appetitive. The animal sees the lever, he presses the lever, he gets some food. What did the animal learn? He did not, according to Thorndike, learn that if he presses the lever, he'll get food. What he learned was, when I see the lever, I press it. See it, press it. Because what followed was good, it established those associations. This is known as a stimulus-response association. It is extremely parsimonious. It does not account for all behavior, but it's a very important principle, and I'm going to give you some examples of how in a moment. Associative connections are lost when what follows is bad. If the animal sees the lever and presses the lever and he gets shocked, according to Thorndike, the lever connected to the action, the stimulus lever, connected to the behavior, that withers away and dies. So the animal's likelihood of pressing it goes down. Once again, according to Thorndike, the animal does not learn that its actions produce good things. It simply says that those good things help to establish a connection between a stimulus and a behavior. See the stimulus, do the behavior. Stimulus response. It does not require an animal that thinks or cognitively rationalizes something. It is a stimulus response connection. But it's also true throughout the animal kingdom. Honeybees, beetles, fish, birds, rats, humans. We have stimulus response learning within us. I'm not saying it's how we learn everything, but it does play a big role in many of our behaviors. This sometimes is known as implicit learning, sometimes non-declarative, as opposed to bringing it up to your conscious brain. This is just actions that happen because of trial and error learning of your life. So let's take a look at this. The animal comes in, presses the lever, and gets cheese. Tell me, what did the animal learn? I'll give you a second. If you said, the animal learned, if I press the key, I get food, you are not talking about Thorndike's theoretical law of effect. If you said, the animal sees the lever, and that causes the lever to be pressed by the animal, stimulus lever, pressing response, that's what he learned, that's true. The rat learned, see the lever, stimulus, press the lever, response. This connection is created because what follows is good. These are the associations here, not response to reward. Behaviors are caused by the stimuli that precede them. It's kind of a hard theory to wrap your mind around. Let me give you a couple of examples. This example I've been giving for many years, and I don't think it's as relevant because I don't think there's as many stick shift cars out there. But, you know, there's an automatic car. The car shifts gears itself, right? But if you get into a car that's a stick shift, if you've ever gotten into a car that's stick shift, there's some things that happen, then you have to follow some rules. When you hear the engine rev, you press the clutch with your left foot and you shift with your right hand. And you do that for a long time, you just get into the routine. Hear the engine rev, that's the stimulus. The behavior, clutch in, shift. You get to the point you don't even think about it anymore because it's implicit. It's not, oh, I'm thinking about everything I'm doing. You just get into this pattern. What follows is good is the car doesn't stall. The car goes forward. You get to where you want to go. Now, what's funny about that is if you drive a stick shift for a long time and then you get into a car that's an automatic, you start shifting things that don't need to be shifted. You start hitting a clutch that's not there because you hear the engine rev and it causes the behavior. It causes the leg to twitch. It causes you to reach down to shift because you're into that stimulus response action. So stimulus response learning is not how everything is learned, but again, it plays a big role, and we're going to talk about that. It plays a big role in drug addiction, foraging for food and animals, in early education with kids. Remember, Thorndike wrote a bunch of books, and especially in sports and muscle learning. So if you've ever played baseball or softball or something, you know, if you ask a professional baseball player or even a good baseball player, you say, what are you thinking about? You know, what are you thinking about cognitively when that ball's coming at you and you're going to swing at it? And any good baseball player will say, I'm not thinking about anything. There's been thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of balls pitched at me, and I've swung at a lot of them. I've connected with some, I haven't connected with others. And when I see that ball, I either swing or I don't. It has to be very fast because that pitch is coming in really quickly. That decision has to be made very quickly. It's a stimulus response. If the ball is in a good position, you swing. In bad position, you don't swing. It's not like you're thinking about it. Gymnasts, divers, they're not thinking. This is my sport. This is what I did when I was in college. I did this in high school and college. I was a diver. And I went and dove for a lot of years. I even dove for companies like SeaWorld and stuff and put on shows. I used to do a dive. I was a good twister. This guy's doing a twist. I like to twist. And so I did a dive called 1.5 somersaults with 3 twists. And I did that on the springboard. And the whole dive lasts about 1.5 seconds from the time I leave the diving board to the time I enter the water. And I'm doing 1.5 somersaults and I'm twisting around 3 times. I'm not thinking while I'm doing it. Okay? Diving is a great sport for punishment and reward. If I do a dive correctly, I land on my head and there's no pain. And I'm happy. Instantly. If I do a dive poorly, I land on my stomach or my legs or my back and it hurts a lot. Punished quickly. But while I'm doing the dive, while a gymnast is doing we're not thinking. You just have to do it a lot. Nobody reads about these things and says, well, I've read a full book on springboard diving. I think I got it. I think I can do it. How do you do well at this? You practice. A piano player, a guitar player. If you're good at it, are you thinking about it? No, you've just done scales for hours and hours and hours. You've practiced and practiced and practiced. And then the notes on the page become the fingers in the way that they're going along the piano. Okay? These are stimulus response. They aren't brought to a cognitive level. So another person, about the same time as Thorndike, although Thorndike came a little after, was Pavlov, Ivan Pavlov. He was also about these implicit motivation principles. And he was actually a physiologist and won a Nobel Prize for physiology. He looked at the digestive system of dogs. And then he decided to change his focus. And which is kind of interesting because what he found was he wanted his dogs to salivate because he wanted to record all the salivation. But what he noticed was when he walked in, they started salivating already. Or when somebody came in to feed them, they would salivate already. And he began to study that principle of how does the dog know they're going to get fed? How does the dog prepare itself for food coming? What are those mechanisms? In the time in Russia, there were other people who were looking at what's known as reflexology, the study of reflexes, a stimulus response. The nervous system was being understood in the late 1800s, early 1900s for the first time. So he wanted to look at the sort of physiological and theoretical components of these very simple learning mechanisms. So he theorized about how these things take place. So here's the example. A neutral stimulus like a light or a tone or a buzzer is played to the animal. The animal does nothing. This is followed with food. First the light, then the food. In temporal contiguity, together in time. Right? Together in time, temporal contiguity. And after a while, the animal begins to salivate to the light. It naturally salivates to food. You give them food, they salivate. But then the light began to produce this response, this learned response. It began to salivate to the light. Light comes on. Give the animal some food. Yum, 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 yum. Now he's salivating to the food right now. We call that an unconditioned response to an unconditioned stimulus. Conditioned means to learn. We're conditioned. An unconditioned stimulus, like food, the animal doesn't have to learn anything. There's no learning. It naturally salivates. The light, however, is the conditioned stimulus. First, it produces no response, and after a while, the light itself produces salivation. So what do you call that? If the food is the unconditioned stimulus, something the animal tastes as stimulus, and the salivation to the food is the unconditioned response, and the light is the conditioned stimulus, then the salivation to the light is the conditioned response. We're going to go over that again, okay? Bring two stimuli together in time, temporal contiguity, and they become associated. If you want to know what the most basic part of our brain, our psychology, is for us as animals, as all animals, is to predict our future. There it is. That's what we want to do. We want to predict our future. We want to know where food is. We want to know where an enemy is, a predator is, a mate is, where warmth is, where cold is. We want to know what's coming. Classical conditioning does that for us. It tells us food's coming. It tells us pain's coming. It tells us that this stimulus is giving me information that something's going to happen. It makes our world more predictable. A world without prediction is an animal that dies very quickly. So the first stimulus is telling the animal that it's going to produce the second stimulus. So let's just go and review this. We are born with certain stimuli causing innately connected to responses. If you take a little baby and shine a little light in their eye, their eyes will constrict. Their pupils will constrict automatically, okay? We're going to look at some of these reflexes. Pavlov knew about these reflexes. All you do is bring a stimulus into that reflex, into that automatic reflex. And that stimulus will then take on the qualities of the US. Ring a bell, give an animal food. The bell, in a sense, becomes food. Or it becomes a predictor of food. Okay? The brain is designed to learn about the relationship in their environments. This is that prediction I was talking about. It creates a neural association between the CS and the US. Okay, so here's a dog brain. I drew that. That's my dog brain. And the animal innately has a connection, an association, a connection between the parts of the brain that registers food, the US center as Pavlov called it, and the part of the brain that causes salivation. The US is connected to the UR innately without any learning. So if I take a dog, I put a little lemon juice on its tongue, it salivates. I give him a liver cheesy doggy snack, it salivates. He doesn't have to learn about that. But if I take something like this light and I pair it in temporal contiguity, they two are active at the same time. If two areas of the brain are active at the same time, they connect as an association. Okay? The light connects to the part of the brain that registers food. The light tells them food's coming. Eventually, it might be, after enough pairings, light and food, and light and food, and light and food, that because this part of the brain is active too, the response center and the light center are active at the same time. The part of the brain that registers light, the part of the brain that causes salivation are active at the same time. We might get a CS just connected directly to the CR. You can go through this pattern. The light comes on, the animal thinks of food. Food connects to the salivation center and the animal salivates. Could it be just the light causes the salivation? Could be just that direct. Okay? This is also a form of implicit learning. You don't need to think about it consciously. Insects do this. I know because I studied this in insects and honeybees. They classically condition. Fish classically condition. All animals classically condition. You classically condition. You know what's going to happen? This is a funny thing. One day you're going to be walking through the hall, and maybe you haven't met me. Maybe you don't know who I am because you're just listening to my voice. And I'll be talking to somebody. And as you walk by, you will get a sense because you'll hear my voice, and there'll be something, an emotion will come out. A happy emotion, whoa, that because I love this class so much, or a aversive emotion. You'll hear my voice and you'll just feel dread. Oh, that class, dread. Because there's an association between my voice and an emotion that you might be having. Okay? You don't need to bring this up to a conscious level. Walk into Kentucky Fried Chicken with its 11 herbs and spices, and the whole system of your digestive system will begin to be activated. You'll salivate, you'll produce digestive enzymes from your liver, from your pancreas, from your small intestine, from your stomach. All these things happen. Try doing that now. Just try to make that activation in your body happen now. You can't. These are implicit. Smell those things and it happens. But these can be very influential on very complex behaviors too. It's not just about salivation. Classical conditioning is not just about salivation. It's about everything. It is the cornerstone of how you learn things. 99% of the things you learn are classically conditioned. Okay? The stuff is declarative, like remembering this material, remembering where you parked your car. Okay, you learn those things too. But you're constantly adjusting by classical conditioning, much more so. Phobias. I'm just going to give you a few examples. Phobias are a perfect example of classical conditioning, and it shows the strength of it. Okay? So, let's say you were scared of spiders. Okay, granted not a giant spider on your chest, but let's say there's a tiny little spider and you're scared of the spider. Well, the conscious brain says go over and step on the spider and everything's fine. But if you have a strong phobia, you'll run away. You'll get dizzy. Okay? The rational brain will be overridden by that. We're going to talk about that in another lecture. What about advertisement? Advertisement is 90% classical conditioning. It's all about classical conditioning. It's all about getting you to produce an emotion or a feeling or anything, even a appetitive, and connecting that with a product. Okay? Marlboro, cigarettes. Worst thing you can do for your body is smoke these damn things. Okay? Smoke these things and you are not a cowboy. You're not on a horse. But what a great ad. Marlboro, tough guy. Okay? Carl's Jr. What if they... I can picture their board meeting. What we should do is take half-naked people, half-naked women, put them on cars, put them on whatever, and we'll just say Carl's Jr. Carl's Jr. naked women. Carl's Jr. partially naked women. Carl's Jr. Do that enough times and that association is in your brain. You're driving home maybe. You're just driving home. You're not even that hungry. You're like, hey, look, there's Carl's Jr. there. You might not even go. Carl's Jr. equals naked women. But it elicits the emotion, whatever that emotion is, that makes you drive in and buy their burgers. Okay? Sex sells. Fear sells. Okay? It's a wonderful way of getting you to not like something, make you scared of it. But we see this all the time, politicians. Every time you see a politician, especially presidential elections, they put things behind them that are supposed to elicit certain behavior, certain motivations, certain emotions. You pair them in temporal continuity. Barack Obama, American flag. Patriotism. Connect the two. You can't help it, by the way. You're not looking at this ad and saying, or this speech and saying, Barack Obama is very patriotic. He loves America. I love America, blah, blah, blah. No, it's just association. He's not the only politician to do it. They all do it. They set people behind you that they want you to identify with, and because they're occurring together, you connect them. You connect them and you can't help it. Classical conditioning. I thought this was kind of a funny movie, but this is really saying it. Go for this was based on a comedy, but this is what they're trying to do. Eagle, America, wonderful, Brady, Congress, push them together. You just put them together. That's how people make you do things. How they motivate you to buy things you don't necessarily need. Vote the way you want. Do the things you want. If you don't think classical conditioning is highly motivating, classical conditioning is the most motivating part of association and learning that you have. Think about that.